I've seen the Crown Prince, the Shah's son, Crown Prince Reza, kind of running around doing media, kind of presenting himself as the alternative, the kind of democratic alternative to the clerical regime, and I just find it laughable. You're not going back to, you're certainly not going back to a monarchy, and no, but to just reinforce the point, I think that any kind of democratic opposition now can be tarred with the brush of being lackeys of the Americans and the Israelis, and that's death in Iran. No, I think it's been set back years, the opposition.
I'm pleased to say Scott Anderson joins me now. Scott, welcome to Times Radio.
Oh, thanks so much. Nice to be here.
Great to have you on. Tell me about the Shah's Iran. What was it like? What was life like there?
I think it was a very strange place. It was a clash between sort of a first world and a third world country. You had an elite that lived very well. In some ways, it was a very progressive country. That it was the most highest percentage of college graduates anywhere in the Middle East. Women wore miniskirts in downtown Tehran in the 1970s. But then, meanwhile, 10 miles out in the countryside, people were still living in mud huts, using dried camel dung for fuel. So it was really a place of two very different worlds.
Yeah, there sounds a real contrast there. Look, so Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, he took the title Shah or King of Kings. Was he a modernizer, or was he an out of touch elite? How should we see him?
He was a modernizer. He's one of the most contradictory people I've ever studied. He was a progressive. He, especially with women, really liberated women to an amazing degree in the country, but also an autocrat, and imperious, arrogant, insecure, brilliant. He was just a bundle of contradictions. People say he was a Shakespearean character, but he was really about four Shakespearean characters rolled into one. So,
yes, I can see that. And look, how closely aligned were Iran and the USA in the 70s, and what difference did that make to Iran? What difference did that make to him? Did it make him nervous? Did it make him complacent? What did it do?
They were joined at the hip. There was no alliance, outside of maybe the one with Britain and the United States that was closer. It made him, I mentioned before, he was insecure. He was constantly looking for reaffirmation from the Americans, and at the same time, within Iran, he was seen as the American Shah. As too close to the Americans. So once the revolution got started, and this is the bizarre thing, because even his enemies had to recognize he was a brilliant man. But once the revolution got started, and there really were elements to the revolution that were, it was religious, but it was also kind of anti-colonial. They really saw the Shah as a servant to the Americans. While the revolution was going on, the Shah keeps asking the Americans to come out publicly in praise of him and say, he's our man in Tehran, kind of not realizing this was the absolute worst. This was the problem. It was the absolute worst thing he could do. A very contradictory figure.
Did he see himself in a way as closer to the Americans than he did to his own people?
I believe he did. I really believe he did. He was educated in Switzerland. He was surrounded by a kind of intelligentsia professional class, who almost all his close advisors had also gone to school in Europe. He had an obsession with the English royalty, and very much wanted to emulate them. I think he was really sort of out of touch with his own people, and he also increasingly, it's this classic autocratic behavior. As time went on, he very rarely left the palace, so he was surrounded by these sycophants who just told him what he wanted to hear, and was more and more removed from the common people.
So Jimmy Carter visited Tehran on New Year's Eve in 1977, and he praised the stability that the Shah had created there. It's the last time an American president ever set foot on Iranian soil. Right. There were riots and crackdowns in the months that followed, which of course led to the collapse of the Shah's regime in 79. What had been going on in Iran in the background that both the Americans and both the Shah himself had been ignoring during that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. There had been, in 1974, the Shah masterminded a quadrupling of oil prices, and that That triggered the greatest transfer of wealth in world history from Europe and the United States to the Middle East. Um, other oil producing countries wisely didn't pour all that money right back into their economies right away. The Shah did, and it caused a massive inflation. He was trying to build this world class army. It ended up being the fifth most powerful army in the world. But meanwhile, it also caused this massive influx of people from the countryside, mostly young men, and the countryside was very religious. So you had, and then because the economy overheated, so very quickly this gold rush collapsed. It became a depression, or recession, at least in Iran. Meanwhile, you have during this gold rush, you have tens of thousands of foreigners, mostly Americans, coming in to build. Take over the oil industry, to build up the arms industry, and that becomes a real source of resentment. So by 1977, you had the Iranian economy wasn't in complete collapse, but had been, very severe recession. You had millions of young unemployed men in the ghettos around Tehran and other cities. So you really did have this kind of seething underclass that the Shah seemed oblivious to.
And in the book, yeah, you question whether the King of Kings or his wife, Farah Pahlavi, whether they really understood that they were resented, that they were seen as totemic of all the things that were going wrong in Iran.
No, that's right. And I interviewed Farah Pahlavi, the widow of the Shah, who's 86 now, and she had a common touch that the Shah never had, and really, probably 2-3 years before the start of the revolution, she sensed something wrong. She was very very charismatic, and prior to that, wherever she went in Iran, she would be not in a forced way, but in a very spontaneous way. Greeted by well wishers, women would give her flowers. She was really quite well liked, if not loved, in Iran, and she felt things changing. And she tried to warn her husband, and he just wouldn't hear it. And she tried to warn him again and again, and it just didn't happen.
Who was Ruhollah Khomeini, who became the Ayatollah? Was he a natural choice for a revolutionary leader?
I don't think he was a natural choice. In fact, I think in a perverse way, that's why he became the leader, because he was not a likely choice. He was a compromise choice. You had, by the time the revolution's going on, you have this spectrum of opposition to the Shah, ranging from the educated elite all the way to the rural and religious poor. Khomeini had this image. So I think it's important to note the Shah rarely killed his political opposition. He more tended to buy them off. So what you had within the Shah's Iran was this, including senior clerics. They were put on sinecures, opposition politicians. So there's a vast patronage system. But Khomeini had been sent into exile 15 years before the war, so he seemed incorruptible. There's no reason to pay off a guy who's in exile. So he kind of emerged as this incorruptible, inflexible figure when so many of the mainstream opposition seemed tainted. And I think as the revolution got going, the more liberal aspects of the opposition thought, well, we need some unifying thing. We can't start arguing amongst ourselves. Here's this cleric in his late 70s. He's not going to be a figure. He was often compared with Gandhi. That Gandhi had that role of kind of the spiritual leader of a revolution, and I think that's what Khomeini was. What no one, I think, realized at the time was that Khomeini was very cunning and very manipulative, and he played this. He wasn't just this victim of history, man who happened to be at the right place at the right time. He very much steered things to his benefit.
Well, so the Americans were largely broadsided by the revolution, but not all of them. One American did see it coming. Tell us about Michael Matrinko.
Matrinko is a fascinating figure. He first went to Iran in 1970 as a Peace Corps volunteer. Knew Farsi and knew Turkish, and he was first based in this small town in the Western Mountains, but really came to love Iran, and he's a very gregarious guy. He's still around, and had a wide circle of friends. Realized really early on that the Shah was not loved by his people, They would make jokes about him behind his back. Um, and he came back to Iran in 1977 now as a foreign service officer, and he was sent to the visa office in Tehran, and the Iranians applying for visas had just become a stampede. And what Michael realized as he was is talking to these people in their native language is they were taking their money out of the country, and very well, I think very well off people to middle class were getting out.
Mm.
And when he tried to report this to his higher ups, he was, well, first of all, he was just kind of shut down. But then when he really became sort of a problem, a thorn in the embassy side, they shipped him off to a provincial city to be the consular officer there. But time and again, Matrinko tried to warn the embassy, tried to warn the State Department back in Washington of this kind of seething volcano. And time and again, he was ignored.
Nobody wanted to hear it.
Right.
Look, Iran today is still an authoritarian, totalitarian, theocratic state. Survived more than 40 years more of the West's hostility, which I'm sure not everybody expected it to do. How do Iranians feel today about the Shah and about the revolution? Can we even know?
Well, it's interesting. So I'll answer that in two ways. One, 80% of Iranians today were born after the revolution. So, perhaps 10, 12, 15% have any memory of life under the Shah. For everybody else, they've been inculcated over the last 45 years of propaganda to think of him as sort of the servant of the great state. I don't think there's any great love, even among people of the Iranian diaspora that I've interviewed. There's never any great love for the Shah, and
Mm.
even people who have lost everything with the revolution taking over, they sort of blame the Shah for what happened. Um, Second thing I was going to say is since the Israeli and the American bombing of Iran last month, I have a kind of a small network of people inside Iran that I talk to by Zoom or by phone, and most of these people are in the opposition to the clerical regime. Um, Virtually all of them have said this bombing has gutted us, has set the opposition back years. And because
Right.
what's happened in Iran is this massive kind of rallying around the flag effect. And now the regime can paint any opposition as servants of the Americans and the Israelis. And that's really devastating. So the opposition, I think, is very, very despondent now as a result of the bombings.
And I mean, what the attitude is towards America now. President Trump, he repeatedly expressed his preference to do a deal with Iran rather than bombing the hell out of it, and
Right,
then appears to have sort of changed his mind. He talks about Iran as the bully of the Middle East,
right.
bent on building a nuclear bomb. What what do Iranians now see as being the role of the United States, the future likely behavior of the United States? Do they see themselves as still very much locked in an existential struggle with the United States?
I think they do. The strange thing with Trump is that it's kind of the madman theory. Right? It's like he's so unpredictable. And I remember before, 3 or 4 months ago, thinking, God, could Trump actually be the guy who normalizes relations with Iran after all this time? And I think some
Mm.
Iranians thought that too. His whole approach to things is so unpredictable and unorthodox that seemed a chance that could happen. And instead, now we've flipped completely the other way. I suspect most Iranians, and including the government, they don't know where they stand now. It's because Trump could turn around tomorrow and say, okay, let's start having talks about normalization, or he could bomb them again tomorrow. You really don't know. So I suspect, just as I feel about what most of what Trump does, everything's a question mark until it actually happens.
Would you say that the bombing? I mean, you virtually did say, but just to clarify, the bombing of the American and the Israeli bombing. The hope in Washington is that this leads to a sort of collapse of the Iranian regime, a takeover by democratic forces. Has the bombing made that less likely?
Far less likely. Far less
Really?
likely. Yeah, absolutely, far less likely. And I've seen the crown prince, the Shah's son, Crown Prince Reza, kind of running around doing media, kind of presenting himself as the alternative, the kind of democratic alternative to the clerical regime. And I just find it laughable. you're not going back to. You're certainly not going back to a monarchy. And no, but to just reinforce the point, I think that any kind of democratic opposition now can be tarred with the brush of being lackeys of the Americans and the
Hmm.
Israelis, and that's death in Iran. No, I think it's been set back years. The opposition movement.
And look, finally, the function of the bombing, at least from the American perspective, and also, albeit maybe more complexly from the Israeli perspective, was supposedly to eliminate the nuclear threat from Iran. Uh, what is that nuclear threat today? How likely is it that Iran becomes a nuclear state? How different is that trajectory today from what it was several months ago?
I've never bought into this idea of Iran being a nuclear threat. If it's a matter of how long it takes to get something on a launch pad and to launch it, I think North Korea is far far greater threat. Um, I know the technology, the spy satellite technology that the Israelis have and the Americans have. If they were to develop a nuclear weapon, the minute it started rolling out to the launch pad, it would be destroyed. I mean,
Mm.
the instant. So I've never bought. I've always felt that there's something else at work here. I mean, Netanyahu's been beating this drum for a decade now about Iran's nuclear weapons, and I think that there is. It reminds me a bit. I think the Iranian government knows that they would never be allowed to, even if they had the capability, they would never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. But it kind of reminds me a little bit of the situation Saddam Hussein got with his fictitious weapons of mass destruction. He didn't want to come out. Saddam Hussein didn't want to come out and admit he didn't have anything, and so as a result, the Americans invaded Iraq. And I think in a similar way, the Iranians don't want to admit that they don't have they do not have the capability now, and B, the Western world would never let them develop it in the
Mm.
future. So I've always felt there's kind of that's kind of a Trojan horse sort of thing that
I know. I said finally, but one more while I've got you. Well, I mean, in the wake of the bombing and in the wake of Israel's very effective destruction of Iranian proxies in Lebanon, very successful assault on the Houthis in Yemen, and on Hamas as well. Obviously, does Iran feel weaker? Does it feel more at risk? Does it feel more fragile than it did?
I think it has to feel more fragile as far as its proxies go. They've lost all of them virtually, or certainly they've all been you know much reduced. Um, I think it's a paradox. I think they feel much weaker internationally or regionally, but the regime, for the reasons I've said, I think they probably feel
Mm.
stronger internally because now
Yeah.
they've put the country on a war footing that benefits them. It always benefits the party in power, and now they have a common enemy. So,
Mm.
so I think that's the dichotomy you have with Iran right now.
Well, look, utterly fascinating. I wish we had longer. The book is King of Kings, The Fall of the Shah, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and the Unmaking of the Modern Middle East. And it is out now. Scott Anderson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you for having me on.